Well, hey folks, just wanted to check in with you real quick and give you an update on our essays for each chapter. For the most part, I'm enjoying reading them, and I'm getting some really good ideas about how your thought process is working. But I wanted to really quickly, before we get too far into this, make sure that I'm focusing you on the right things. Some of you are doing a pretty good job of writing. What you're writing is written pretty well. It's really good grammar-wise and spelling-wise and flow-wise. But in some cases, you're not really hitting the question that was asked. So I wanted to take just a few minutes in this video and reflect back on the Chapter 3 assignments, Assignment 5, and look at each one of the questions very quickly and suggest to you where that question really ought to go in terms of answering the question. Because ultimately, the success in this class, and I think success in life, is related to how well do you answer the question that was asked. And as a quick aside, it's very frequent in our house when we're eating dinner or something, and we'll be done with our first plate of food, and I'll look at my daughter and I'll say, "Do you want any more?" And she'll say, "I'm good." And I'll go, "I know you're good, but that's not the question that I asked." And I'm trying to really get my kids, even at 15 to 17, to figure out what the question is that's being asked and to answer the question that was asked. As that 17-year-old is working on an English comp class with undergrad, I'm trying to focus her before she even starts writing something. I go in and I sit down with her and I read the assignment and I say, okay, what is it that this teacher is asking? Make sure that you answer the question that was asked, because no matter how well you write, no matter how fluid and how fluent and all those kinds of things you are, if you don't answer the question, you haven't accomplished what we've asked you to accomplish. And I don't want to seem too alarming, but I was seeing in a lot of cases on the Chapter 3 assignments where you were kind of talking, but it wasn't related directly, I thought at least, to the question that was asked. So very quickly, let's look at those questions again. The first question talked about land, labor, capital, and the entrepreneur. And the question that was being asked was two parts. Number one, to discuss the contribution of each, and number two, to talk about whether you could succeed without one of them. So if your paper really did those two things, in my mind, it's perfect. In some cases, I really felt like you kind of wandered off the topic and you really spent a lot of time addressing something that's not part of that question. And I hated in occasions that I created a grading rubric where it was either 7 or 5 or nothing. And I would have loved to have been able to assign 3 or 4 in some cases, because you made a pretty good effort at what you did, but it wasn't what I was asking you to do. And so I hated to go towards the 0, and I probably gave you the 5, which ended up giving you an 8 overall. And a B on some of these papers is not, in my mind, really reflective of what it was trying to do. I would have loved to have been able to assign some C's in some cases. But in question number 1, what several of you did was really kind of define what land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur are. And the question didn't ask you to define what they are. You have to assume at this level, with a doctorate, that I know what those things mean. The question was, what contribution do they make? Yeah, land is the physical things, the raw materials and the ground and whatnot. But what contribution does that make? The contribution is that it gives you a place to do it, to run your business, to establish your business, to build the factory, the resources that you need to go into creating the product. That's the contribution. With the labor, it's the people and the ideas and things like that. But that's the definition. What contribution does that make? And then a number of you on that one in particular who wrote about it didn't really address, I don't think, can a business, can success exist without one of those things? And some of you said, no, you need them all. But there are businesses that don't have a physical location. They don't have property to their name. Service-related industries don't necessarily need a physical location, so land may not be critical. A lot of businesses are very successful, internet-based businesses, very successful without a lot of labor. So, you as the entrepreneur would have to provide some labor, but in the sense of a lot of people working for you, you may not. So some of those four things aren't necessarily critical depending on what your product or service is. That would have been really interesting to talk about. Question number 2, an entrepreneur, anyone who bought or made a product at a certain cost to sell at an uncertain price. That's the quote. What is the question? The question is, how has that definition changed? And the key things in that, in my mind, were the idea of a product that was being bought or made. Has that changed? Yeah, it's not always products anymore. A lot of times, most of the time perhaps, it's services. So in that sense, the entrepreneur has changed in some regards from being someone who bought or made a product to somebody who is designing and delivering a service. That's a change. The other thing that was significant to me was the part about selling at an uncertain price. And to me, that's not the case really anymore. An entrepreneur today is somebody who sees a need in the marketplace and fills it. But seeing that there's a need for bowling alley in Americus doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to go bowling. So the part that's changing is not the uncertain price. The market determines what that price is. What has changed is the product or the service being delivered in a market that may not see the same need that you do. So those are the kind of things that I think that you might have talked about in an excellent essay. Question number 3, 3 aspects of labor: recruitment, training, motivation, discipline. Discuss how they've changed. You probably did a great job of defining what they were, but not necessarily talking about how they're different today. A couple of you did a real good job with that. Number 4, 3 ways to motivate people: positive inducements, negative sanctions, efforts to build a new factory ethos or to create a culture where people want to be there and want to work hard and produce quality. The question was, discuss how they're still used and which tend to be more effective in various situations. And so where I would have a complaint with a lot of the essays that I got is that you defined them pretty well, and you may have given examples of them, which kind of goes into the how are they still used, but that's more of the methodology rather than the motivation. How are they used? Some of that you answered, but some of you didn't get to the second part, which is which ones are more effective in various situations. And where I would see a good opportunity to answer that, a good avenue for that, is that certain kinds of these things are very effective in manufacturing. Certain kinds are very effective in service. Certain kinds are very effective maybe in a university setting or in a law enforcement setting or whatnot. But you might not have, in some cases, you didn't talk about the settings where they're effective. And that's the point of the question. And what I want you to do through this class is to look at these questions and extend them out into the real world and figure out how to use them. Understanding what positive inducements are is great, but figuring out how you can use it, how you can be effective with that, how you can be effective with negative sanctions, when they're appropriate, what's not, and how you use that is great. Question number 5, nobody tried to answer, which is okay. The development of management, how would the industrial development have been different if we'd emphasized college-level management education back then? A lot of great opportunities to hypothesize, and this one may have been the easiest for you to write on, because where there are some right and wrong answers to the other ones, how might it have been different involves a lot of projective thinking and creative thinking, and it's hard to say you're wrong in terms of that. Question 6, British government held a belief that low wages provide an incentive to work. There's 2 parts to this question. How do you think they rationalized that, part 1? And part 2, how could that actually inspire people to work harder or longer? And some of you kind of talked about the rationalization, but some of you just kind of wandered around a little bit. What I really was kind of hoping that you were going to do was, especially in relation to the second part, how did that inspire people? And the simple logic to me is that if you need $20 and I'm willing to pay you $4 an hour, you only have to work 5 hours, then you quit. But if I only pay you $2, you have to work 10 hours to get that same amount. So reducing wages, providing lower wages, might actually inspire you to work longer because you'll work 10 hours instead of 5 hours. That's a great discussion to have on this question. Question number 7 talked about child and female labor, and there were 2 parts to that question. Part 1 is, why was it so critical to businesses? And part 2, why was it so appealing to the women and the children? And some of you talked about the conditions of the work. That's not part of the question. The fact that they worked long hours, the fact that they had demeaning jobs or they were kind of abused is interesting, but it's not related to either of the questions that was asked. Why was it critical? Why did businesses so badly need women and children? That's why it's so critical. And why did women and children... some of you talked about the need. They had to work to get the money, but that's not necessarily what made it appealing. So the question would have been greatly answered if you'd have talked about the mindset of the women and the children. What made it appealing? Maybe it was appealing to get out of the house for a while. Maybe it was appealing because it made little kids feel much more grown up. But what I really want to get you to start focusing on from here forward, and I haven't graded chapter 4 yet. I realize that you've already submitted that. Some of you have already submitted chapter 5, and you can't use this video to impact those. But going forward, anything you haven't submitted this week, anything next week and forward through the end of the semester, don't just read the question and say, that one sounds interesting, I'm going to start writing, but really study it for a moment and say, what's he asking here? You ought to be able to, in each one of the questions, get down to 1 or 2 main points. And if you will focus your paper on those 1 or 2 main points, you'll do really, really well. And now that I have kind of alerted you to the fact that I'm not looking for you to just kind of fill in the gaps or whatever, I'm not looking for you to give a lot of background information. I would rather you spend a page and a quarter, page and a half maybe, page and a third, really focusing on the main question that was asked, than to spend 2 full pages kind of giving a lot of background and fluff filler kind of stuff. I'm more likely now, starting with chapter 5, not chapter 4, starting with chapter 5 and chapter 6, I'm more likely now to start giving some 0s instead of 5s on that content part if you don't really hit the question. And I may at some point actually go in and change my rubric to give me the flexibility of giving 3 points instead of a 5 or a 0. If you've kind of wandered or something, and start factoring that in. Anyway, I'll try to give you periodic videos like this if I see where you've got some room to make some improvements. And please understand, this is kind of a global broadcast, but it doesn't impact every one of you. Some of you are really, I'm sorry. Some of you are really figuring out what the question is, and you're attacking it right away. The only thing I would say, even if you attack the real question, figure out a way to kind of expand on it and draw from it and create inferences from it, because I want you to be able to write a page and a half, not a page and a third. Although I said that I'd rather you do a page and a third that really addressed the question than 2 pages that didn't. You still, I think, ought to be able to come up with a page and a half, page and 3/4, something like that, because double space, that's less than 1 full page. You ought to be able to do that. Anyway, give me an email, or get me on Collaborate, or post something to the discussion board if you have questions, and we'll try to address them. Going forward, I want to see a slight change of focus on how you do these things. If you're interested in a question and you're just having a real hard time figuring out what the main idea is that you should address, shoot me an email or something in the middle of the week and let me say, this is what I'd like to see you write about. And then you write about it however you want to, as long as you talk about that thing. I'll be happy to give you some direction if you're not sure where to write and how to go. But really try to shy away from giving a lot of background or definitional kinds of things. Okay? Hope that makes sense. Hope that's helpful. And look forward to hearing from you if there's any questions about it.